All right, I guess we can go ahead and get started. We're a minute past the starting time. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for being here. I will share my screen real quick. Can you all see that?
Yes, it is not in presenter mode, just in case you wanted
Okay.
it to be.
Yes. Is that here? Wait, how did I do this before? There we go. All
Yeah,
right.
that looks good.
Okay, great. Yeah. Thanks everyone for coming. My name's Anna Weber. I'm the chair of the Student Affairs Committee for the Society of Conservation Biology North America. Our webinar today is focused on uh, kind of just career development in the field of conservation. Um, but before we start with our actual webinar content, I'm just going to give a quick overview of sort of what our society does for anybody who may be unfamiliar. So SCBNA is it's a professional society focused on the conservation of biodiversity, healthy ecosystems, and human connections. SCB North America specifically is sort of a region within the broader global Society for Conservation Biology. And as a region, our mission is to provide a venue to connect diverse students and professionals to advance and apply conservation knowledge, and to welcome, support, and empower all voices engaged in conservation to contribute to equitable solutions and catalyze wonder for the natural world. So essentially, kind of to summarize that, what we are is a big, broad organization, kind of devoted to anything related to conservation. We have members who are biologists, social scientists, economists, artists, all kinds of things that are related to the field of conservation. So very broad. Our members have access to professional development opportunities, such as this webinar, for example. Um, we host conferences every 2 years, with the next one being in Milwaukee in 2026. And then the Global Society also puts out, I believe, 3 different research publications that members can subscribe to for access to the latest news and research in conservation. If you're interested in learning more about the organization, you can go ahead and scan this QR code. It just takes you to our website where you can get all the information you might need. So the webinar, more specifically, is being hosted by the Student Affairs Committee within SCBNA. So our role is to essentially provide resources and support to our student and early career professional members. So by students, I'm including graduate and undergraduates. So we do networking events and professional development activities like webinars like this, as well as skill building workshops. These can happen both virtually, like right now, and in person during our conferences that are every 2 years. So we have a pretty sizable list of people on the committee. If you're interested in helping us organize more events for students, feel free to send me an email. My contact information is there on the screen. And I'll probably also put it in the chat if you'd like more information. So this is the first of our winter webinars for 2025. So this set of 3 focuses on professional networking and career development. After the one today, we will have one in March on which is basically just an introduction to fundraising for nonprofits in conservation. And then one in April that is more geared towards undergraduates. So it will be focused on different ways that undergrads can set themselves up well for a career in conservation through coursework or internships, research opportunities, that sort of thing. So today's webinar is just sort of a Q&A and short talks on careers in conservation. The 3 of us are going to just sort of give brief presentations, and then we'll just turn it over to a general Q&A session. So the 3 speakers today are Dr. Becky Huft, who is the current president of SCBNA and the associate director of applied conservation at the Denver Botanic Gardens, and Bernie Trevisary, who is our director of operations and programs for our society, and me. I'm a postdoc at Florida Institute of Technology. So we'll get to our webinar here in a second, but before we do that, I just kind of want to acknowledge that something that might be a bit of an elephant in the room for those of us in the US, which is that due to the recent executive orders that have been coming out, our field is changing a lot. and is likely to continue changing in the coming months and years. So the three of us are going to be talking about our experiences up to now. But I just want to acknowledge that we're in a really dynamic kind of situation right now. Our society did recently release a public statement on our position on all these actions. So if you're interested in reading that, I'll go ahead and put it in the chat when I'm done talking. But for now, I think I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our first speaker, Bernie Traversari.
Thank you, Anna. I think that was a great introduction, and the mention of our sort of field being in flux, I think, is a good intro to sort of my presentation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to essentially tell you all a little bit about my own career in conservation, essentially how I got to where I am right now. And sort of the message with that is that it was not a straightforward path, and I had to pivot quite a bit during each step of my career. But that taught me that there is no one clear way to become involved in conservation, and it's good to acquire a broad set of skills so that you can really do a variety of things within the field. So I am going to also share my screen. Perfect. Can everyone see this? Assume so. Okay, so where to begin? I was born and raised in Quito, Ecuador. I completed high school in Ecuador, and I guess the first step in my professional career was really deciding what I wanted to do after high school. It may seem that because of the position I am in right now, I chose to go into something related to conservation, but that was really not the case. After I graduated from high school in Ecuador, my first step was going into medical school. So things in Latin America work a little bit differently than in the US. You don't go to pre-med, you go directly into medical school for 6 years. And so that was the first step in my educational career, was going into medical school. Now, the cool thing about that is that I went into medical school, and for the first 2 years, I had to take a bunch of science-based courses. And one of the courses I had to take was zoology, funny enough. And it was that experience in zoology that got me thinking about the potential for a career, perhaps not directly related to conservation initially, but a career in the sciences, doing scientific research, exploring more about the realities and mysteries of our natural world. And so after about 2 years of medical school, and almost immediately after taking that zoology course, I decided to switch tracks. And so at that point, I figured the best way for me to continue a potential career in, at this point, science research and applying science to study our natural world was going to the US and getting a degree in the sciences. So I transferred to Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. And at Trinity, I first kind of dove into a few different potential majors. I went into engineering for a little bit. I took one course in neuroscience, and then I settled in biology. I had a really good experience in my biology classes, took a few more courses focused on ecology and evolution. And then I also engaged in research. That was my first actual experience with research, was focused on ecology and conservation biology. I worked with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department as a part of that project. And my advisor really pushed me to consider a career in conservation at this point. So this was the first time I had ever considered, this was almost 4 years, after 4 years of higher education, first time I had ever considered going into conservation. So I didn't know much about the field. I knew I enjoyed doing research on it. I knew that was something that I could thrive in. And so I wasn't really thinking about what I was going to do in conservation. I just knew it was a good way to continue doing research that interested me. So after my stint at Trinity and after doing some initial research, I decided to continue pursuing graduate school in the US. And so I started my master's at Washington State in the eastern portion of Washington, which is really pretty if you haven't gone there. And at Washington State, I pursued a master's degree in conservation biology. My focus was mostly on developmental ecology, so seeing how different environmental factors affect organismal development and how that can be applied to conservation. But But throughout this process, I started to become involved in a much more applied conservation project. So I was working with a number of different partners in Washington State, including the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, the Oregon Zoo, a couple of other zoos in the Seattle area, and also Idaho Fish and Game to help both protect the northern leopard frog populations that still remain in Washington, and also support a reintroduction project for those species. So that was a really interesting experience because I was still doing research. That was what I was primarily interested in. But because of going into that specific type of research project with all of these partners, I started to become more and more involved in partnership development, applied conservation work, working with different stakeholders, seeing how all of those pieces come together to actually formulate a conservation plan. And this was for only one species, so I was really intrigued by that entire process. And then coincidentally, during this time, I also had the opportunity to do some volunteer outreach work with a local environmental nonprofit called the Phoenix Conservancy. I was their volunteer outreach manager for about 2 years during my master's. And again, this gave me a really good opportunity to just do a lot more community engagement. And at that point, I had thought, a lot of research is done outside of the community. You conduct your research in a lab, you then try to apply that sort of in isolated ways from the rest of the stakeholders. But I realized pretty quickly that was not the case. There's so many individuals, so many organizations, so many stakeholders you need to interact with, that it became clear that it was a good idea to develop some of those outreach skills and being able to communicate not only your work and your science in different ways, but to be able to interact with very different people, not only academics, and not only those that work in some of these very common fish and game agencies. So up until now, I had acquired a couple of different skills. I knew I was good at research. I knew I was good at doing outreach and communicating with different stakeholders. And so after finishing my master's, I thought I was going to go and be a field biologist and be able to do all of these things. But as it so often happens in life, that was not the case. I ended up moving to Wisconsin, primarily because of my wife's job, and I couldn't really find a job as a biologist initially. And so I had to, again, sort of transition what the idea of my career would be. And I got a job doing community-based science education for Edgewood College in Madison. I was their director of science outreach for about 2 years, had nothing to do with my time as a researcher in conservation or in biology, but it had a lot to do with my time doing outreach and engaging in those partnership building exercises as part of my applied conservation project. So while it might not have been a really clear line from what I had been doing before up to this point, I was still able to apply a lot of those skills, and I was able to acquire more. I took on a lot of administrative and operational responsibilities that I realized I really enjoyed doing. And so I started to transition a bit more outside of the field-based biology work that I thought I wanted to do to more of a support and operational side of things, which is really important to the success of a lot of conservation projects, especially for nonprofits like SCP&A. And so after a few years of working as director of science outreach for Edgewood, I found this job with SCP&A and I applied for it and I got it. And I realized that I was able to utilize a lot of the skills that I had acquired in this one very specific job. This job does not require me to be an expert in research, does not require me to be an expert in any one species, but it does require me to be able to interact with a lot of different stakeholders. It does require that I am able to communicate what we do in very different ways. It does require that I am good at partnership building, right? And so I realized that my ability to pivot from different stages of my career to do other things and to acquire different skill sets was really instrumental in me getting to where I am right now and to enjoying what I do and to being successful. So I wanted to paint this picture because, again, my trajectory was not linear. And I always stress to those folks that want to go into conservation, you don't need to see it as going straight from an undergrad in biology to a grad program in biology to then a field-based biology type of job. There's many different things you can do within conservation, and it pays to be able to acquire all of these different skill sets. So that's my presentation for now. I think, Becky, now we're on to you.
Great. So I just want to one say that and you still have the slides up, I think, too. Bernie, do they just continue on, or whoever has them up? Yes, thank you. One, thank you, Bernie. We have most of us are volunteers who serve on the board. And we only have one full-time staff member, another part-time staff member, and Bernie is our only full-time staff member for the organization and keeps everything afloat. So we are very fortunate to have Bernie and the career path that took you to being here. So I had written actually down a couple of things I wanted to make sure that I said. It's funny, Bernie, because I almost word for word, you already said them. So I just want to reiterate, I think that like we did not actually plan this. And so I think, as far as what you were going to say, that speaks, I think, to how universal these two things are, which is one, that most career paths aren't linear and no one path is the same. And I'm going to share my career path. And I sometimes am hesitant too, because I actually was very linear, but most of my students and people I advise and other, folks I work with did not do that. And they are very successful in their, careers and lives as well. And then the other, which I'd like to talk about a little bit more later, is especially in our current environment of job opportunities, is thinking about diversity and diversifying your skill sets and your experiences and how you can play into those strengths for different applications. So that can kind of maybe be for discussion later, but I've also found that to be true, and you spoke to that as well, Bernie. Am I able to advance? Does someone have to advance them for me? You're going to advance them for me. Amazing. All right. I just are here to say these are kind of where I grew up. I grew up in the kind of southern parts of the US. And I do think where you grow up, both culturally and just environmentally, does shape, right, your experiences and kind of what you want to do. And also kind of affect kind of how you get to where you end up eventually. So for me, growing up, starting out in Texas, but mostly growing up in Kentucky and spending a lot of time outdoors camping and hiking, I think I kind of knew from a young age what direction I wanted to take. You can go to the next one, Bernie. And so I went to Chicago and got a biology degree, and spent the whole time doing, working in the lab and in the field, mostly with plants, doing plant ecology and evolutionary biology research and getting a lot of experience. And from that, you can go to the next one. I did go straight to graduate school after college, and I got my PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology at UC Santa Cruz. But while I was there, I had my main project I worked on, which was very much, I would say, kind of a basic evolutionary questions about plant evolution. But I also did side projects where because I just even at the time felt like I didn't want to stay in academia, and I wanted to do a more of applied career path. And so I did side projects on kind of applied restoration and conservation projects and gained some additional skill sets, and also took I was fortunate to be at a university that was a member of the Organization for Tropical Studies, and so was able to go spend a couple months in Costa Rica, where I also gained experience not only doing tropical research, but working with lots of different organisms, and most importantly, animals, which will come later in a future job I received, given that my background is mostly plants. But even those 2 months having all this other experience turned out to be invaluable for future jobs. So after grad school, the next one, I moved to Colorado and did a postdoc at Colorado State University in more of an ag program looking at invasive species and still thinking about genetics and evolution and population genetics of an invasive grass. And while I was there, only a year in, a job opportunity presented itself. Next slide, or next one. Yep, at NEON, which is the National Ecological Observatory Network, which is also in Colorado. And it was just starting. So this was in the in 2007-ish. And so I was one of the first employees there and got to work with the National Science Foundation and with the organization to kind of design what NEON would become. But I do think one of the reasons I got that job was because the position I had was really overseeing all of the organismal sampling, which included plants and soil and microbes and insects and birds and mammals. And not many people, right, can come in and have all of those experiences. But because of my different projects I'd worked on during graduate school, I actually had experience catching birds and catching bats and doing insect pan traps and and small mammal trapping, even though that wasn't my focus and my background was really more in plants and insects than other things. And so there, though, I also got project management experience. And I think in working with GIS and databases and thinking about satellite imagery and remote sensing, right? That job really also exposed me to all of these other skill sets and partnerships. And then from there, I moved on to Denver Botanic Gardens, where I currently am. And so I've been here at the Gardens since, when did I come here? 2011. So I've been here at Denver Botanic Gardens since 2011 and moved into a few different roles here. And as part of this job, I'm not only able to work in conservation and restoration, but also do service and do professional service to other organizations. So I do think it's important to note that these are the places where I got my education and maybe got got paid, right? These are the places that hired me and where my job is. But if you can go to the next slide, Bernie, I just want to me, it's also really important to think about service and engagement. And I also advise graduate students at the University of Colorado. I'm clearly here on the board for Society for Conservation Biology. I also serve on committees and conference planning for the Society for Ecological Restoration, as well as do service work with the Center for Plant Conservation and the American Public Gardens Association. These are all very different networks and communities of professionals who do different but similar things. And I not only, I find it rewarding to work with these organizations, but I also think they've expanded my network and expanded my experiences. And to me, also just feel like a duty as far as like my service back, like what I give back to my job as well. So I'm also fortunate to be in a job where I can do these things as part of my job, and kind of have it just be incorporated. So I just want to, there's different ways that you can gain experiences and make connections. And sometimes it's with your main job, but other times it's through service and these other engagement opportunities. That's my highlights. I think I will pass it off to Anna.
Okay, great. Bernie, are you okay with continuing slides?
I am, yes, happy to do it.
Great, cool. Okay, so you're going to probably hear a lot of similar elements in what I'm saying as what Bernie and Becky have both said. But I'm going to kind of follow the same path in terms of just sort of outlining my career trajectory so far. As I mentioned, way back in my intro, I am currently a postdoc at the Florida Institute of Technology. So I'm pretty squarely in the realm of academia and research. But I did shift my focus a lot within that realm throughout the years. And so I thought it might be interesting to just kind of go over how things have changed since then and what kind of led me to where I'm at now. So I grew up in Southwest Michigan, although I was born in Indiana, so I have a little arrow. But most of my childhood was in Michigan. I was always a big, nature lover, animal lover, all that kinds of things. And so even though I really hated my high school science classes, I opted to go for a biology degree. And I went to a small liberal arts college called Alma College. And I picked that school largely because of the opportunities that it had to fund international service and undergraduate research. So through Alma, I got to travel quite a bit, which I can talk about in the Q&A if anybody is interested. And I got to do quite a bit of kind of undergrad level research. So I had initially enrolled in college with the intention of becoming a wildlife veterinarian, which I think is maybe a fairly common experience. But over time, through doing projects in classes, and doing this research with different faculty, I found that what I really enjoyed the most was digging into scientific problems, designing experiments, and trying to find answers to those problems. And I also saw how some of my undergraduate professors were really, really involved in local environmental policy and advocacy. And so seeing all that, like what I really wanted the whole time had been to be involved in conservation and help make the world a better place. And also finding this love of research, I thought, well, maybe academia is a better fit for me, seeing how all my professors were so involved in their communities. So I decided at that point, wasn't going to try the veterinarian thing any longer. I was going to switch to trying to become a professor, a university professor. So I did get more involved in undergraduate research at that time. I worked with a faculty member at Alma who was an avian ecologist. and I got involved in bird banding. So I helped him band birds at different sites throughout Michigan and elsewhere. And when I graduated, he actually is the one who gifted me my SCBNA membership. I remember at the time he didn't actually tell me anything about it or what it was. He just kind of gave me this paper and said, use this wisely. And so even though I maintained the membership, I didn't really know much about the society, and I didn't really become active until quite a bit later, which I'll talk about. But anyway, after undergrad, I took a year off from school. I had the intention actually of joining the Peace Corps before going to graduate school. I had a big travel bug, but things didn't quite work out as I planned. Actually was put on the wait list for the Peace Corps, and then ultimately didn't pass the medical clearance because I was having some knee problems. So that left me with nothing to do, which at the time was very hard for me to deal with. But because I had had that research experience as an undergrad, I started helping out at a local nature preserve, which Bernie, you can advance the slide, which also had a bird banding program. So I got to kind of continue doing the same things that I was doing as an undergrad. And after a few months, they actually hired me as a seasonal field assistant. So during this time when I was, living with my parents after undergrad, I started studying for the ACTs and researching graduate schools. And I was reading a lot. I even took a couple of community college classes, kind of trying to boost my transcript and learn more about conservation and fill in the gaps of things that I felt like I ought to know before I go to grad school. And this is when I first got exposed to the field of conservation genetics. So at that point, up until then, I had really had zero interest at all in genetics. I'd avoided it as much as I possibly could because I'd really only ever heard about it from a perspective of human medicine. And I really had no idea that you could use it in conservation. And I became really fascinated by this idea. So I kind of took a bit of a risk. And even though I'd never done anything in genetics ever, decided to look for a graduate program where I could become a conservation geneticist. So by this time, I had been doing bird banding in various capacities for quite a few months. And I was lucky enough to be offered a summer position, and you can advance the slide, Bernie, with the Institute of Bird Populations in California. So that gave me about 4 months living in a tent at a campsite in Yosemite National Park, where I got up around 4 a.m. every day to go around the park and band birds in different areas. And so it was during one of my kind of twice a week visits into town to check my email that I got an acceptance to graduate school and an offer of a teaching assistantship. So Bernie, you can advance. So the graduate program that I was accepted into, which is at the University of New Orleans, was a massive switch from anything I'd done before. It was a conservation genetics project, but it was on mandrills, which are these huge monkeys in Central Africa. They've got their really colorful faces and butts. So going from birds to primates and strictly pretty much field work to genetics was a huge jump. But I went, and it was really hard, and it had a really massive learning curve. I will say the PhD took me 7 years, I think, to get through. And I had, of course, all the challenges that come with grad school. I would be lying if I said it wasn't hard. But then it was around this time, and I think, Bernie, you can advance again. Around this time that I started to become actually more involved in SCBNA as a student representative, because kind of similar to what Becky was saying about service and having a desire to give back, I really wanted to find a way to provide support to other students like myself. Especially, I'd been in grad school for quite a long time at that point, and so I felt like I had some experience to be able to offer people, especially people who may not be getting what they need from their own institutions. So that's when I really started to be involved with this society and became the student affairs representative. But despite all the challenges of graduate school, I really enjoyed it. I loved, and I still love, finding ways that genetics can be applied to conservation. I'm glad that it's a switch that I made. And then in January 2023, I defended my dissertation and began a postdoc the following March, which is where I'm at now, at the Florida Institute of Technology. So again, this was another giant switch. So at Florida Tech, I am still doing some genetics, but it's switched to a lot more spatial modeling. And it's not on primates anymore, it's on sharks now. So we've really changed taxonomic groups a lot, but the common thread has been genetics. And each of these different places that I've been to have picked up another really diverse set of skills. So now for but I look at myself and I see the different sort of academic skills that I have. Field work is something I'm strong in. Modeling statistics is something that I'm strong in, and so is genetics. So that's just all come from, repeatedly switching fields over and over again. And it is difficult, it is challenging to do, but you can really gain a lot of benefit out of it. And yeah, I think that's pretty much all I have to say for my career highlights so far. I'd love to probably switch it over to Q&A at this point, which I think Bernie is going to moderate.
Yes, that's fantastic. I will say I didn't know a lot of what the two of you shared with the rest of us today. So it's a really interesting career path for both of you.
Yeah, we're getting to know each other.
Yeah. So I guess the rest of the session is really a Q&A for those in attendance. Feel free to share questions, comments on the chat, or just unmute yourself and ask us questions. We are here to sort of elaborate a bit more on our different career paths and offer advice where we can. I think Anna mentioned that we will have a few more webinars throughout the winter that will focus on maybe more specific, what courses should you take, what internships can you do. So this is maybe a way to jumpstart that, if you will.
And I'll just say too, I think just for myself, and you guys can speak, but right, I hire a lot of people. So I have a lot of experience with what I think works and doesn't work when people apply for things. I have thoughts on state and federal applications versus nonprofits and how I do think those applications differ and what you should prioritize. Yeah, and just thinking about how to market yourself when you see jobs. So I think any of those types of questions, are on the table. I don't know if folks have questions. Otherwise, we can also just keep sharing things, but I'll see if anyone would like to. Feel free to unmute or write in the chat.
Okay. Nicole has one question. Do you have to have experience all over the country to be successful in biology, or could you still be successful in one state?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
That's one thing I noticed about all our maps. All of us have these arrows going all over the places.
Yes.
I was just going to say, I think it depends a lot on what kind of biology you're doing. That's one part of it. I would say absolutely you can be successful in one state. It depends a lot on your focus, and what you're doing. If you're involved in local work, that could be one way to do it. I will say academia, if you want to go the route of like undergrad, master's, PhD, postdoc, academia, blah blah blah, you might end up having to move around. But it just depends on what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I'll share that. I think it depends on the job. So for instance, I do hire lots of positions where the people need to have experience in the ecosystems and plant identification where we are doing our work, right? And so that does mean like maybe you've had plant experiments since Maine, but it's a very different flora, right? So honestly, people who have done their work here are going to have a leg up, right? Because they already know the flora and the habitat here. So there are certain jobs that are that way where it actually is a benefit to be like in the state. I agree with Anna. I think one of my other pieces of advice for people is that I think for our field, you can either like really know what you want to do and be willing to move wherever to be able to like find a job for that thing, or due to personal, whether it's you just liking the place that you live or you have other family constraints, let's say, that you need to stay in a geographic region, then I think you need to be really open to lots of different types of jobs to apply for, right? To be able to find a position where you live. And some people are super lucky that they can like stay where they want to be, where they are right now and get their dream job. I think for most of us, there's some maybe compromise there, right? Of having to be willing to move other places or be willing to kind of just be open-minded to a consult, various different types of jobs that maybe you just didn't think about. Like, I don't know that going through school, until I worked in college in graduate school and in college in museums, like the idea like that botanic gardens would have conservation and restoration positions, like wasn't even on my radar. You know what I mean? Like there's just all these different types of jobs out there that you might not even be aware of. And so I do think if you want to, like for me, when I got this job, it was right. I was geographically had constrained to staying here in the kind of my Colorado region for family reasons. And and it has turned into a dream job for me. But I will say, like, it wasn't on my radar initially, like when I started my career, that like that would be a place I would land. So
We'll also add, if you're an undergraduate student, you might hear what I consider to be sort of a myth right now, that if you do your undergrad in one state, you have to go to grad school in a different state because everyone's looking for that variety of experience.
Yeah.
And the more I talk to actual researchers, faculty, employers, everyone's told me that's not true. Like
agreed.
if you stay within the same state and do all of your degrees within the same state, that's totally fine. It's really the experience you get from all of those and the skills you build that matters. It doesn't matter whether you've been in 4 different states throughout your academic career. That's going to give you a leg up. So that's something else to consider.
Yeah.
Bernie, can I ask a clarifying question? What about different institutions in the same state? Or do you see people staying at the same institution?
When I was in Washington State doing my master's, there was a big push to get students who were interested in pursuing advanced degrees in science to stay in Washington State throughout their entire career. And I think there was a lot of good coordination between the faculty at the school or at the university and employers within the state to say, yes, please stay here and let's create a pipeline so that you don't have to move necessarily. You don't have to feel pressured to get that out of state experience. You can do all of it here and then find a job that suits what you're looking to do and suits your experience. But I guess it applies to both, right? There's an opportunity to stay within the same institution if you can do that and that works for you, or stay within the same state.
Yeah, as a hiring manager, I will just say I don't care where someone went. To me, it's really the experiences and that people have gained, their ability to articulate how those experiences, that like they understand what they've done, and then also that they can translate that work into how it applies to the job they're applying for, right? All right, a couple more questions here. Are you gonna read them, Bernie?
I'll read them. I'll go for the next
Okay.
one.
Okay.
So what is your advice for early career professionals applying to graduate programs? I recently graduated from undergrad and have had a few seasonal fieldwork positions, but I have been struggling with securing a master's or PhD assistantship.
Okay. Do you want to start, Anna, because you're most recent in that, and then I
Sure.
can speak from an advisor role.
Yeah. I also need to jump off in 5 or 10 minutes. So if anybody has any questions specifically for me, now is the time. But yeah, this is a good one. So definitely making connections is pretty key. With universities, you really want to be talking to people that you want to work with. I'll tell you, in my experience, I emailed a ton of people and mostly didn't hear back, which I think is pretty common. But you kind of just have to keep at it, keep getting in touch with people. Like look on university websites, go find faculty individual websites, read about what they do, send them emails, try to develop a rapport, discuss the research with them, ask genuine questions, those kinds of things. In terms of assistantships, that is, I mean, you want to have an assistantship if you're going to graduate school. I will say it seems like master's assistantships are getting harder and harder to find. I was lucky that my university offered one, but since I left my university, I'm seeing lots that don't seem to offer TA positions for masters, for example. So I'm not sure, maybe Becky, you have thoughts on that. PhD assistantships tend to have better luck for assistantships in my experience. But yeah, I think it comes down mostly to generating a rapport and making connections with faculty. I will say I was ultimately only really able to make a good connection with one faculty member, got that one acceptance, and that's the university that I went to.
But that's all you needed.
That's all you need.
Right? Like that's all you need, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that's actually a good point. So a couple things. One, you generally only know, people are only sharing that one thing that was successful. You don't know how many other things they applied to they didn't get, whether that's a job or graduate school. So just always keep that in your mind too. If like, right, when you're thinking about people's paths, that oftentimes people aren't sharing, like, oh, I actually applied to like 1,000 places and it didn't get in. Yes. So my own personal philosophy is that I do not take on graduate students to advise unless I have funding for them. So I don't feel that that it makes sense in our field to pay for graduate school. Now there are plenty of programs as a master, I agree with you, that are a master, like a pay master's program, and then PhD for PhDs, they have more TA-ships and RA-ships and things. That is just often the funding model of those programs, where it's really the masters who are funding the PhD programs. But that's not everywhere. I think each university is going to be a little bit different, and some are going to have TA-ships available for master students as well. I completely agree that the only way really to get into these programs for most universities is to have a relationship with a faculty advisor. And by that, I just mean maybe by August of the fall that you're applying, you're sending emails to reach out and say, I see, I've read a couple of your papers, or I've saw on your website, this is why your research interests me. This is what I'm interested. Could we set up a time to talk? Right. And then when I get those, right, I will respond in a couple of ways. I do respond to folks, Anna. So one is maybe just like, oh, I don't have space this year. I'm sorry I can't help you, because that's just the case, right? Like, I don't take on students that I don't have time for, or if I don't have funding to be able to support them, because I don't think that's fair to the student. But if I think it's someone that really matches my interests, I might recommend a different person I know who might be taking students, right? That's another way. If I do have space and funding, and this person seems like our research align, I'll set up a quick half-hour virtual meeting, and in that time just talk through all the various things of what we'd be able to offer, how our interests might overlap, and then kind of help that person through the application process, which is usually December, right? Time frame is usually when applications are. So at least for the university that I'm affiliated with, as well as the ones for my postdoc and graduate school and where I went to undergrad, that is the only path to get into graduate school, is you have to have a faculty advisor who is going to say to the graduate committee that is reviewing the applications, I want that student in my lab. And this is how I will support them, whether it's just with research topics or advising support or actual financial. You will, in almost all cases, except for a few programs in this country, that is the only way in. There's no just generic application to get in. So it is building that relationship with somebody who you think you might want to work with, and maybe having a few of them. You could, it doesn't bother me if the student is having that conversation with multiple other people, right? And then picking the best offer, right? Because that's in your best interest. I'm not insulted or offended by that. Yeah, Bertie.
There was one more thing that I wanted to add. And this might be, you might think of this as a sort of a hack, right, for grad school, but I phrase it as being open to different alternatives. So I just went through this with my cousin who wants to go to graduate school and to do conservation. And she was really set on doing marine conservation. And marine programs, for instance, are usually housed within schools of natural resources. Those schools tend to have fewer financial resources to provide assistantships to their students, specifically masters, versus biology schools or schools of biological sciences. And a lot of higher education institutions have a lot of funding, because those graduate students that are usually doing a master's or a PhD in the biological sciences teach all of the intro to bio courses for a bunch of different majors. So you might find that there are programs that are housed within schools of biological science that are fully funded masters or fully funded PhDs, because they have a bunch of teaching assistantships for students, because of all the courses they need to teach. It's unfortunate that that's the case and that natural resources do not have as many. But if you're open to doing a biology degree versus a natural science degree, right, you still might be able to get the same skills. You still might be able to work with the same organisms. You might not do as much applied work if that's really what you're looking for. But it is a way to get a master's degree where you're still able to, to move forward in your academic career and potentially find funding for your degree.
I'd like to add too, just because I didn't know that this existed when I was applying to grad schools, and this is something that is a little dicey under this administration, but you can look for doctoral fellowships. Like the NSF has always had the GRFP, for example, and there's maybe nonprofits or other institutions that may offer similar things. Don't know what's going to happen to those over the next year, but keep an eye out for them, because if you have a fellowship, if you have your own funding, usually any university will kind of want you to come there if they don't have to pay for you.
Are you good, Bernie, if we move to the next question just to keep?
I am.
Okay. So this one was about, go ahead.
Oh yeah. So next question. A lot of jobs seem to be either for BS or PhD postdocs. How does one prepare themselves better to be a competitive applicant for higher level jobs if you have a master's? Do you think having a PhD is essential?
So I'll say no, I do not think a PhD is essential. Most of my graduate students, I have some PhD students, but many are master students, and they've all managed to find jobs after they graduated, some in various winding ways, right? Like all of us. But I think that if you are applying for jobs that require just an undergraduate degree, you are still more qualified with a master's, right? You'll actually come in. A lot of places put the minimum degree required, and that actually is to open up the field to a more diverse array of people who've come from different life experiences. So, like your experience might be that you have a master's, right? It's just that somebody else might be coming in with a bachelor's and then 10 years of experience. Those are just different experiences, but the most of those jobs are trying to open it up to allow for different types of candidates to apply. I think there's plenty of jobs out there at the consulting, nonprofit, state, and federal, with the caveat of federal for right now, at the master's level. So I think the distinction is most of the federal grants, to be a PI on many of them, you have to have a PhD. To be faculty or advise graduate students, you have to have a PhD. But that is a small portion of the types of jobs that are available for conservation. So that would be my take. And there's some director level people at Light Gardens and at other places who are master's level people. So for instance, for my job, a PhD is not required. Like I have a PhD, I'm in my position. A master's is actually the level. Like I wouldn't be able to be advising graduate students, but I've just added that on to my job. That wasn't really part of my job. So yeah, I'll just say that. I don't know if others want to hop in.
I was just going to add that I see a lot of state agency positions for master's level.
Yeah,
I
agree.
Yeah.
Yep. I was going to say the same thing. The only thing I've ever heard was if you want to go into and be in a PI and doing research as your full-time career, then PhD is probably the way you want to go. Otherwise, not super needed.
Agreed. Yeah.
Next question.
I should probably hop off at this point.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you, Anna.
Yeah. Thanks everybody for coming. Bye.
Bye. Okay. Next question. How did you all get involved with working with partners such as U.S. Fish and Wildlife, state departments while at state fish and wildlife departments while at grad school? Did you reach out on your own to volunteer your time, or were they already part of the project that you joined? I can tackle this first. From my experience, I was lucky in that my advisor in grad school had a research project that was already developed with all of these partners. But throughout my master's degree, we were able to bring in more partners into the fold and work with other groups simply by reaching out and saying, hey, we're doing this. Are you interested? Let's find a way to collaborate. And that was what I saw with other groups within my same program with other PIs. They would think of an interesting idea. They would potentially reach out to these state fish and wildlife agencies and see where there was a potential for collaboration. So, and interacting with staff at some of these agencies, I also learned that there's opportunities for volunteerism and seasonal jobs all the time. That was especially true with Washington Fish and Wildlife, Idaho Fish and Game. Yes, there's always opportunities to be involved and to find ways to collaborate.
I'll just say too that I did not get involved so much while I was a graduate student, but I now partner with a lot of those agencies. It's just part of my job, and I try to make sure that I'm as appropriate for my graduate students, making sure they make those connections. And then oftentimes either their funding comes from there or the project, they're working on a project with those federal partners to allow them to create their own relationships and develop those partnerships. So I think the best, you could always reach out to people on your own. I think the most successful though would be to have a mentor or somebody, whether it's your actual advisor or just somebody else, another professional who's working with them, and get involved with them to kind of introduce you and get your foot in the door to projects to get engaged with.
I will, as Becky's looking through the questions, I'm going to quickly plug in. We are actually doing a whole series on state wildlife conservation. That's a Poly series. It's not specifically focused on advertising jobs or anything like that, but there are a lot of folks that are part of those agencies that are going to be speaking at the series or in attendance. So if you want to get just connected to them, I encourage you to register and attend our next session, which is taking place on Thursday next week. Okay, that's it.
I think the next question is on, thank you, Bernie, for that. And that's a great session to participate in. What skills developing? I think earlier I mentioned skills I think, and I always recommend to my graduate students and early career folks and seasonals I work with. So skills especially if you go look at jobs that are available, right? Especially entry-level positions, there are a set of skills that people need that sometimes they don't have. So GIS, for sure. Having analysis skills, so thinking about your R skills. A lot of consulting jobs do need that kind of like wetland delineation and kind of plant ID skills, like or some kind of organismal ID. So just having some of those skills like will allow you to get different types of jobs in that way. But I do think having GIS and some analytical abilities help too. Bernie, what are yours?
I would say from a logistical or operational standpoint, if that's something of interest to you, learning how to build partnerships is really useful. And by that, I mean not just who to reach out to, but actually finding ways for different groups to interact with one another and being able to tell what strengths can be leveraged from each of those groups, I think it has been really practical for me. And I think I see that in a lot of logistical conservation jobs, right? Where you're still doing project management, maybe you're not in the field, but you are helping supervise everyone else that is. Or you're trying to coordinate amongst different people who are in the field. So,
and grant writing,
and
right?
grant
A lot
writing.
of what we do is right, applying for grants, or whether it's from private donors or from government agencies. And I would say project management is in fact the majority of my job, right? Managing people, projects, partnerships, and money, right, is what I do to enable all the science and the conservation to happen. So
yeah, money is important.
Yeah.
Hence our next session on fundraising.
Yes. Oh, this one. Okay. Yes, I did mention earlier that I do. So here's some specific advice I have. This is about, right, you apply to different places, and I would highly recommend, even though it takes time, to cater your application for that job, right? As someone who is hiring, I can tell immediately if you have just submitted like just the same cover letter and resume that you submit everywhere, right? And that doesn't mean I won't think about putting you in my short list, but like it's not as you're not like I don't, it's much nicer if you cater that cover letter. This is nonprofits. So I'm gonna start with the nonprofits and I'll say how it's different for like the state and federal agencies in my experience. So as someone in the nonprofit world, like I actually look at every single applicant that I'm having a job for. Like I don't have another screener, right? I don't have like HR isn't screening these first. So I am reading the cover letter. And that's where I'll then go look at the resume to be like, does that match up? Everything they said in the cover letter, is it backed up by something in the resume? But that 1-page cover letter should tell me specifically why you have the skill set to do the job that you're applying for. So like that is what I like to see when people are applying for jobs that I'm looking at. That is quite different than when you're applying for state and federal jobs. Those tend to have either a person or a computer that is doing the screening first. And that means that your application, like the actual like form that you have to fill out, like there's usually an online form with 1,000 different questions that you have to answer. Your answers need to include all of the words that they said were required for you to have as that skill set. And so that means thinking about like, what are the things that you have done that you could translate into those skill sets and making sure those words show up, because someone who is not the hiring manager, right, who's not a specialist in that field, has to screen these to see who's just like qualified. So you just need to make sure that your application as a first step will get past that automatic screening for qualifications, and then make sure you elaborate in certain areas so that the person who's the subject area expert and who's the hiring manager, when they then if it gets to them, right, then they're the ones reviewing it to say like, oh, does this person have what I need? But a lot of people I see don't get past that first screening, even if I actually would argue they are qualified, because they undersell themselves, or they just don't, they're like, oh, well, I don't really consider that thing I did 10 years ago as part of my experience or whatever. I do think people tend to undersell themselves. So they tend to not get past that first screening. And so they don't even get seen by the hiring manager. So I think catering it a bit differently if you're applying for a position at like a government job where you know it's being screened first versus a smaller organization like mine, a nonprofit, where it is just coming to me and I am the person looking at it. So make sure your cover letter speaks to me and tells me why you want that job. So that's my advice on those two different things.
Yeah. And I will
Yeah.
add the underselling part I think is huge, especially if you are thinking about how to market yourself, right?
Mhm.
I think the best example is with a lot of colleagues that were PhD students and decided to go into industry after their program and not academia. They thought their only skill was doing research, right? That was the thing they needed to market. But a lot of their industry supervisors were not really focused on the research skills specifically, right? They were focusing on all the other skills, soft skills they acquired throughout their PhD. They had to manage a budget to be able to complete their project. They had to manage their time wisely. They had to manage the project with many moving parts, right? There's all of those skills that you gain in doing whatever type of job that I think it's really useful as you're looking to market yourself to really break down all of the experiences you've had in the past and try to identify all of those soft skills because you never know which of those you might be able to pull for a specific application, be it with state agencies or nonprofits, right? So that's been a useful skill for me, and I've seen that that being used a lot more by folks coming into the field too.
I know we're getting close to time, so I just, I really appreciate you guys being here, and we're happy to, follow up with us too. If you have other questions you think of later, we're happy to help however we can.
Yeah. Do we want to go with one more question if there is one?
I
Maybe?
don't know if there is. I think we answered them
Yeah.
all, unless I missed one. So I think that might be it. I don't think I skipped any in the chat.
Well, then again, thank you all so much for being here. Yes, as Becky mentioned, please reach out if you have any additional questions. Happy to get back to you. Happy to connect you with other members of our network as well. We always encourage you to become members of the society too. You'll get a lot more information about other programs and webinars and professional development opportunities that are coming up. I will mention that in addition to the two webinars that Anna mentioned at the beginning of the session, we are also working on developing other sessions that are focused on resume building, specifically for careers in conservation. And we're potentially going to do another panel in the future with professionals that are part of industry roles, but still related to environment or conservation work. So keep a lookout for those. I imagine they'll be of interest to most of the folks here. Yeah. Well, thank you all so much.
Thank you.